My name is Katy H. and I'm an alcoholic. Thank you, Jason, for asking me to speak. It's an honor and a privilege to be asked to do anything for Alcoholics Anonymous. I owe Alcoholics Anonymous my life. It saved me, and it definitely gave me an opportunity to have a second chance when I didn't think anything anymore. I was at the jumping off point for an extended period of time before I found my way here. My sobriety date is May 18th of 2011. I do have a sponsor and I do have a home group. In a general way, I'm going to share my experience, strength, and hope with you guys, and what I was like, what happened to me, and what I'm like now. Okay. My childhood was, I guess, normal. There was a lot of love in my family. I didn't have like a typical upbringing, I guess. A lot of childhood angst. I was very quiet, and I didn't see a lot of my dad until my parents. Okay. I guess I gotta talk louder, huh?
Yeah.
You know what? I just don't think that's gonna work. It puts me too far away from the microphone. Okay. Is this better? Alrighty then. My family loved me very much, and if love could have fixed me, it would have. It's something I didn't understand until I started really listening to what you guys had to say, and I started relating. When I say I'm an alcoholic, it means that I can't with 100% guarantee what happens when I take a drink. I don't know if I'm going to be able to stop after one. I don't know if I'm going to be a teetotaler. I don't know what's going to happen. And every time I stop, this is not the first time I've stopped, but every time I stop, I don't know if I'm going to stay stopped, and I don't know for how long. I remember when I was little, I had my very first sip of beer, I think, when I was 5. And I was sitting in my dad's lap, and I wanted to be a part of what was going on so much, because I was very good at being kind of the fly on the wall. I would just sit and I would watch, because if I watched, then it was easier for me to see what I should do, Even when I was little, I didn't fully understand what you're supposed to do in a social circumstance. I didn't know how to introduce myself. I didn't know how to smile until I was 8 or 9. I just didn't smile. I was afraid of everything. I was afraid of shadows. I was afraid of loud noises, but I couldn't let on that I was afraid, and so I was afraid of attention. I didn't want to cry if I fell and scraped my elbow, because all of a sudden everybody would be looking at me, and I didn't want any judgment, even back then. I didn't want anyone to make fun of me because I fell, right? And so I remember actively wanting to be a part of the party, right? And my dad told me I could have a sip. And I did, and I spat it back out because I thought it was disgusting. I just didn't like the taste. I didn't understand why people drank it, I was like, I'd rather have a soda versus a beer, and I think that's a normal reaction for a 5-year-old, right? But I remember having alcoholism just without the alcohol for my entire life, except I didn't realize that until I got sober, that the ism was a big part of everything, right? Just an irrational sense of fear. I remember being very judgmental of everyone, and then for whatever reason, I was always dissatisfied. It didn't matter, if I had just gotten a brand new toy, I just knew that I didn't have what you had, and I wanted what you had because you seemed happy, and I guess I could look happy on the outside, but I didn't feel happy, I didn't feel like I thought you looked, like that judgment of my insides don't match your outsides, right? I felt like the ugly little kid, the awkward kid that was always elbows and knees, and I was too skinny, and my clothes didn't fit, and I was shorter than everybody else, and I had this big gap in between my 2 front teeth for the longest time, and I was the only blonde, and I got made fun of all the time for having hand-me-down clothes, and I was the oldest kid, so it didn't make sense to me why I had hand-me-down clothes, and they never fit. They were like 3 sizes too big, and my mom left shortly after I turned 10, and so it was just me and my dad And my dad's not a big talker. He's a very big guy, and he didn't know what to do with a little girl, and I had really long hair, and I remember my dad sitting there and trying to braid my hair, and just getting frustrated and saying, can we put it in a ponytail today? And I was like, Mama always braids it, and so I had to learn how to braid my own hair, and it sounds like a little thing, but in hindsight, that was probably a really difficult thing for my dad to have to do, and my parents had a really, really, really nasty custody battle. They called the police on each other all the time. There were so many lawyers involved, and my sister was a lot younger, so she didn't really remember my family being together, and she didn't have the little memories of Sunday morning breakfast, the only day that we really saw my dad, because he worked 6 days a week, and he got home after we went to bed, and he went to work before we got up, and so she doesn't have any of that, and so it made things a little more difficult later on, trying to explain things to her about how you don't understand, you have my mom, and that was a big resentment between me and my sister for the longest time. My parents definitely played sides, I remember one Christmas, my dad gave me a present to give to my mom, and so I gave it to her, and I was real excited, part of me really hoped that maybe they'd be able to get back together, right? Every little kid's dream is that their parents will get back together and it'll be one big happy family again, and I found out afterwards that it was a box of coal, and watching my mom cry when she opened it, and I didn't understand, this was a present, and that was my first real introduction to how people can be mean, and especially to people they love, because sometimes when there's that much love and something goes wrong, there's that much pain there. It was a big eye-opener for me, and that was when not a lot of, I grew up in D.C., I think I forgot to mention that, but there wasn't a lot of divorced parents yet, and so that immediately was something for the kids to make fun of me about, and some of them made fun of me openly, and others didn't really know how to talk about it, so they just ignored me, and for a quiet kid, it's hard to make friends anyways. And nobody else really would approach me, and I was too afraid of you to approach you, so I didn't have many friends, and part of me liked it that way. If I don't have any friends, that means you don't know me at the level where it's uncomfortable if you reject me. If you know me, then there's so much more for you to reject me upon, other than like little silly things, right? Like my hair is a different color than yours, or my eyes are a different color than yours. Like superficial things, it's easier for me to take that rejection rather than the things that are really important to me. Like my ideals and my beliefs and my feelings, right? And I was a late bloomer, I guess. I didn't drink until I was 18. I had a couple drinks here and there my senior year of high school. The first time I drank was the first time I got drunk. And it was at a bonfire, and I had just gotten dumped, and I was feeling okay about it, and then I started drinking, and then I really didn't feel okay about it, And I remember thinking, oh, this is fine, and then I stood up, and I fell down, and I was like, oh, that's not too good, and I'm a control freak, a very type A personality, micromanager to the extreme, and I panicked because I didn't have any control over myself, and I was laughing though, it was that instant relief. I didn't realize how uptight I was until I had a drink, and then all of a sudden, just that big deep breath. And everything was okay, and everything was going to be okay. I loved it. I loved the relief. I didn't like the hangover the next morning, though, but I loved the relief, and I drank probably about 6 Smirnoff Ices, 2 mimosas, a couple Jack and Cokes, and I think a bottle of wine, just mixing it up, right? Because I'd never drank before. Nobody that was there had ever drank before. We just kind of mixed everything around, and, we're just like, oh, it's going to happen, and I was just like, I'm not drunk. I can do a cartwheel. And then I got really confused why I kept falling, and I wasn't good at cartwheels before either, so I don't know why I thought that I could do that, I was like, I'm going to be a gymnast. No, I'm not coordinated enough for that, and I knew that. I just was living in some pretend world, right? Like I used to sit in the back seat of a car and look out at other people driving, and I wanted to be you. I didn't know what you were doing. I didn't know where you were going. I just wanted some perspective. I was like, I wonder what you're doing. I was like, you have a car, right? It means you're driving. It means you probably have a job, which means, you're probably going somewhere, and you probably have people that care about you, and I was just this isolated little kid, and I did it to myself. That's the worst part, is in hindsight, I know I did it to myself. I hear people say this, that they feel like first day of kindergarten, they got the rule book to life, right, and social circumstances. I didn't know what that was. I didn't know how to do any of that, and so I obviously relate to that. And I drank maybe once or twice after that. Again, I drank way too much, had a good time, and had a lot of relief from it. It wasn't until I attend St. Andrews, and I came down here, and that's when I really started drinking. I was faced with that alcoholic loneliness for the first time. That it was so painful and so overwhelming that I cried myself to sleep because I didn't know how to handle it, and I like to think I'm a tough cookie and I can handle anything. Just me, myself, and I, right? And I couldn't handle that. And so I was like, I want to do what other people are doing. I want to be where other people are, because I'd rather do that than be here by myself and miserable, right? And so they were drinking, and I was like, I don't really know if I want to do that, and I decided I would rather be happy and with other people than have some morals and guidelines to stand up for, So that was the first line in the sand, and I crossed it immediately, I started drinking a handle every night. I started getting into trouble, and I got in trouble because I was caught holding a beer. And ironically, I didn't drink beer for the first year and a half that I was drinking. I just wouldn't drink it. So I was like, okay, I got in trouble for holding somebody else's beer, the one and only time that was actually true, right? And so I got in trouble with my coaches. I got suspended already from the riding team, and that was why I came down here. And it's what I did for years. It was really a driving force in my life, and it was something that my mom and I shared, and my mom is really important to me, so it was something that I felt really bonded us together. Like I didn't live with my mom, I didn't have a lot of time with my mom, and so it was something that I cherished and that she fully supported. So she would try and be there as much as she could. And she was a cancer survivor, so she was crippled by cancer. She was probably about 4'11" and maybe 95 pounds at that point, so she couldn't really do much, but she loved to hear about it. She loved to hear about it, and I think she just loved to hear about it because of the way I talked about it, all that enthusiasm, and she loved what I loved because she loved me. Unconditional love. My mother had unconditional love for me, and it came out sideways because she was an enabler for me, and I treated that woman terribly. And I'll get back to that more in a little bit. So I started drinking a lot, and I ended up ending a 2-year relationship over my drinking. He said, it's either me or drinking, and I said, see ya. Obviously I'd already made my decision, and at this point I'd been a daily drinker for a couple months. It was only the fall. I'd been drinking steadily for 3 months, and I was already making major life changes. I was already getting drunk every night. I wasn't going to class. I wasn't going to work, and I was smart enough that I could just write the papers and skate on by, right? I could read the book once in a while and then take the test, show up on test day and pass the test, And really, I thought I was getting one over on everybody, but all that was doing was really getting one over on myself, right? I was fully in delusion about the fact that, I could do this and I could do everything, and I felt like I had arrived, right? I had become this party person that I always wanted to be, the it girl in high school that has lots of friends, has no trouble getting dates, except I still had trouble getting dates, ironically enough, sloppy drunk, it's not a good date, so that was kind of a lesson that I missed the memo on that one. But I loved it, I had a meeting with a therapist because I had depression, right, when really it was a hangover. I had a hangover every morning, and I didn't want to get out of bed. So I just couldn't admit that to my mom, right? I couldn't be like, yeah, well, if you drank a case every night, it might make you a little depressed in the morning too, right? And so he's just like, so tell me about your life, and I instantly jump right into, well, I like to party, right? And he stops me and he says, I think you're an alcoholic. And I said, you can take your opinion and do something with that. And I refused to see him again, right? Because I was like, you can't take away something that I care about, right? Like, I'm just having fun. It's just a lifestyle choice, right? I started clubbing and I had a great time with that. And, I did a little bit of dry goods, not too much at that point. I admitted I had a harder time with that, so I wouldn't keep it around me because I thought, drinking's okay. It's illegal for me right now because I'm underage, but it'll be fine. It's not a big deal, right? Everybody does this. It's just a college mentality, right? Except other people were going to class. Other people were showing up for practice. Other people were doing okay. Other people weren't on academic probation. Other people weren't getting sat down by the dean saying you had so much promise and potential. What are you doing with your life? Other people weren't getting scolded by their coaches for coming to practice drunk and for puking at practice because they were drunk at practice. And it just didn't occur to me to start doing things sober. I was just like, I like to do this. I'm just going to do this all the time, right? And one of my good friends was killed in a car accident, and so I was just like, you know what, she was on her way to go party, I'm going to take it as a sign, I'm just going to quit drinking, right? And I stopped drinking for about 4 months. I stopped drinking, and I found a new obsession. He was the boyfriend, new boyfriend, new obsession, right? I have to replace that obsession for alcohol with another obsession because I like to use things to make myself feel better, whether it be people, places, things. I like to use whatever's in my path to make me feel better, right? Because I'm a feeling worshiper. I believe that my feelings are fact. And I don't have to live that way today, but I didn't understand that not everybody feels that way, Not everybody is ruled by their emotions and their emotional nature. I was first introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous actually shortly after that, and I white-knuckled drinking for about 6 months. 6 months I didn't drink. I didn't change anything else, though. I was still going to bars. I was still going to clubs. I was still going to house parties. I was still playing beer pong. I just wasn't drinking, right? I didn't understand that Alcoholics Anonymous is more than just a meeting. It's a way of life. And I wasn't ready. The first time someone said, you don't ever have to drink again, I had a panic attack. I didn't understand what that meant, not drinking again. And I didn't have to drink. It's like, I want to. I don't understand. And so I just wasn't ready, And so I started drinking again. Let's see, it was around Christmas time in 2008, and I had spent 2 weeks not drinking right before that stint in Alcoholics Anonymous, where I was basically just dry, not really doing anything, no solution, because I didn't know I had a problem, right? I just wanted to get everybody off my back. I had been sober and dry and not doing anything for a couple weeks, and I was an RA. It was an opportunity. They had given me a second chance, and I was right in front of it because I hadn't changed anything else. And our book talks about the same person will drink again, and I fully relate with that. I absolutely agree. That is my experience. And I had 14 double shots in an hour. When I go back to drinking, it's always messy like that. I can't control it, and when I went back out the last time, I controlled my drinking, and I got drunk maybe once a month, which compared to every day was a totally different thing, and I was cheering myself on. I was like, I can do this. I'm not an alcoholic, right? Laura talks in our big book about, controlled drinking. I've done everything in there, I've switched from liquor to beer, and I wouldn't drink by myself. I wouldn't drink in the morning. Yet I started doing that, and then my mom died, and I started getting into all kinds of stuff. I felt like she was the last big wall in the sand. I didn't want to do anything to make her upset with me. I didn't want her disapproval. And when she died, it was like all emotions were dead. I didn't talk for about a month and a half. My family expected me to give the eulogy, but I couldn't talk. I had to plan a funeral for someone that we didn't expect to die. And my sister found her, and so my sister had to give the eulogy, and she hadn't cried yet. And then that's when she started crying. It just fell to pieces. She was 14. My 14-year-old sister found my mother bleeding out called the hospital. Ambulance came, and she died on the way to the hospital, less than 5 minutes, and I had to drop everything and go home, and the last thing that I remember talking to my mom, she had sent me a text message, and she was not a good texter at all, like 3 spaces in between every word, like extra periods, no idea how to really text, but she tried because she knew it was easier to communicate with us that way, and she said I worried too much, and I was like, yeah, I worried too much, and then this is what happens, really, and I grew up in organized religion, and after my mom was diagnosed with cancer, I stopped going. I refused to have anything to do with God. I didn't want anything to do with him. I figured if he could make a woman like that suffer for as long as he did, I don't want anything to do with him. And she was devout. She regularly practiced that religion. And she said that God was her saving grace, and I didn't understand, and I thought she was stupid. I was like, this is stupid to have faith in something that has clearly done you wrong, right? That was my whole mentality about it, and I was wrong, but that was my mentality about it, and so I came into a chunk of money when she died, because my 21st birthday was about 6 months after that. And I finally felt like I wasn't going to be in financial fear anymore. I was going to be able to have cigarettes, and I was going to be able to have drinks. I was going to be able to go to the bar and have as much as I wanted and not have to worry about how I was going to pay for it, right? And so when you drink like I do, and when you come into a chunk of money, you spend it rather fast when you're doing that, because I'm a generous drunk, and when I have stuff, I like to share. Right, and so I would wind up with $400 or $500 bar tabs, and it would take me like 3 days to recover, just because I would just sleep, because I was doing other substances as well. And I know this is an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, so all I'm going to say is that they are a big part of my story, and all that they really did was help me get here faster. I bought a house because my next thing was like, this man is going to fix me, I'm all of a sudden used to this mortality idea. So I'm like, what, I have to hurry up and get married and have children, because somebody else is going to die, and little crazy thinking, right? Like certifiably crazy. And so that failed epically because he drank like I did. I wasn't going to be in a relationship with someone that didn't drink like I did, because then he would judge me, right? And so started dating a lesser companion, and then through that, I started sinking lower and lower, doing things that I never thought I would do, getting involved in things I never thought I would get involved in, and by the end, I couldn't keep the water on in my house. I couldn't keep the electric on in my house. I couldn't keep things going at the same time, right? And at this point, like, it had been so long since I showered, because anytime I would feel like, okay, I'm going to do it today, right, the water would be shut off, and then I'd be like, I got to go take care of that, right? And I had a joint checking account, which was a terrible idea. I don't think I will ever get another one of those. But, I racked up a lot of debt from that situation, and I had dreadlocks, not the good kinds. My hair was like piled up on top of my head for so long, and then I was so anxious I would just twist it all back in, and then it was like a rat's nest, just a solid rat's nest, and it probably had dog hair in it, and probably like residual stuff of other stuff, and it probably smelled really terribly. But I had a lot of hippie friends, so usually I just blamed the stench on that, and it wasn't me, and it was just a permanent pillow. If I ever decided to take a nap on the couch, I was good, I didn't have to do a hunt for anything, I didn't have regular meals anymore, obviously if I can't keep the utilities on, I'm unmanageable and I can't go to the grocery store, right? And if I can't keep other things on, then obviously I can't cook because I don't have electricity. And when I have electricity, I don't have gas. And when I have gas, I don't have water, And I didn't have my car down here. I kind of pretty much told my dad I didn't want anything to do with him, and that he was a deadbeat father, and he was dead to me. I had a lot of harsh things to say to my father. And so what happened after that was I was just done. I was down to 95 pounds, skin and bones, and I was just done. I thought about killing myself, I don't know how many times, but I just couldn't do it. I would stand there with this big butcher knife, right, because I'm dramatic. So it had to be a big butcher knife, even though it was just me in the house, right? And I would stand there and I just couldn't do it. Because I would have these moments of clarity where I would think about other people, like my sister, like what would it do to her? At this time, not to tell her story, but my sister is also in our fellowship, and my sister was hitting her bottom at the same time as me, in and out of institutions, suicide attempts, and I knew that if I killed myself, my sister surely would, and it would devastate my father. And as much as I said I hated him, I didn't want him to go through that. This man cried on my shoulder when we buried my mother, even though he hadn't had a nice thing to say about her in 15 years, and so that little bit of vulnerability was enough for me to kind of be reminded that other people have feelings too, even though they're not always the ones that we see, and so in a period of 4 days, I went home for my sister's birthday, and she was sober at the time, and so it was her 16th birthday, and it was a barbecue, and I wasn't allowed to have a drink, and I was like, really? This is stupid, right? I was like, whatever, that's fine. I didn't have money to go buy it for myself, so the only way it was going to happen was if it was there, so I hadn't had a drink in a little bit of time, I guess. Wasn't really sure, and then I had a cocktail at lunch like a couple days later, and that was my last drink. I had a cocktail. Couldn't tell you what it was, just that it was tasty, and I had sipped it because I really was enjoying the flavor, and then it was time to go, and so I downed the whole thing, I didn't want to leave it there, and so I was introduced to Alcoholics Anonymous, and I went to the meeting that night, and there were a lot of people. There were about 200 people. It was about the same number as this room, and it was primarily a young people's group, and so I was having a panic attack. There's a lot of people. I hadn't been able to leave my house in months prior to this, right? So there's a lot of people, a lot of stuff going on. I still had a bald patch of hair from when I'd had to cut a chunk out because I couldn't get all the dreads out, right? And so I'm self-conscious, and I think you're judging me because I'm judging you, and I'm judging all of you, right? And I sat down, and they asked to introduce ourselves. Couldn't do it, I couldn't even speak. I was like squeaking. I was like, okay, not happening, right? And so they offered the chips at the beginning of the meeting there, and I was like, I don't have anything to lose. I really could gain a lot, and I don't have anything left to lose. And so I kind of called myself a name, and then I forced myself to get up there, and I grabbed it, and there were lots of women, and I couldn't make eye contact. I was staring at my feet, I was staring at my feet because my feet are a lot safer than you guys are, right? And what happened from then until the end of that meeting was that I identified with the speaker. I felt like he told my story. I related so much to what he had to say, and I felt like I belonged for the first time in my life. Like, you understand me because I understand you. And I learned in sobriety that's the language of the heart. One alcoholic talking to another, it's so much more powerful than anything else I've ever experienced. And there was a conference that weekend, and I was suggested that I go rather strongly by my current obsession, which was a boy that was not my fiance, and I was obsessed with him because I was like, you know what, we dated when I was 16, and we dated for 2 weeks, and I dumped you because you said I was perfect, right? So I figured this was a sign that I should do this, right? Crazy, but so I decided I would go because he said he wouldn't talk to me unless I called a woman first, and I was like, fine, whatever, I guess I'll do that. And what happened was I was introduced to my sponsor at a noon meeting the next day, and I didn't have anything else to do. My first week of sobriety, I couldn't sleep because I hadn't been sleeping. I was running on like maybe 2 hours of sleep every day if I was lucky. I just couldn't sleep, not because of anything I was doing. My mind and my anxiety and my worry was just working double time on me, and I painted my father's house, the entire house, my first week of sobriety. I mowed both of his lawns, front and back. I buffed his cars, plural, I washed them, I still didn't talk, I didn't have much to say. I was so burnt out that I had 2 brain cells and they weren't talking to each other, and when I spoke, I strung out every vowel. And it was obvious that I was having some issues, and I thought I was fooling people, but, we never are. We always think we are, but we're not. They're on to us, right? And so I was introduced to my sponsor, who shouldn't have been there. That's not a meeting that she normally goes to, and what happened was she shared about losing her mother, and I was like, you know how I feel. I'm going to be on you like white on rice, tell you what. And so what happened was she walked me through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I was lucky enough that through grace, I guess, and in God's direction, I found that She is a big book thumper. She goes straight to the big book. That's our guidelines. It's where the steps and the traditions are. It says how it works, clearly in the table of contents. And what happened was we started with the pages that have letters, not numbers, right? We started there, went all the way back through, and I was lucky enough to fall into a home group back home that there were big book studies, and it's a lot of people that are interested in being sober, and the whole lifestyle that comes with it, practicing the principles in all of our affairs. And that's something that I really have to do today, and not just in Alcoholics Anonymous, because this is only 1 hour of a day where I'm in a meeting, right? But there are 23 other hours in the day. What am I really doing when I'm not around sober people? That's where my program really comes into play. And my sponsor sponsored a lot of women that were about my age, and she used to tell me, I was supposed to call her every day. I would call her, and she said, all right, now you have to call 10 women. And I said, I don't do women. We're not friends, and she had me at 2 weeks sober, right, my 4th step. She said, do it as thorough as you can. And I was like, well, I don't want to drink again. So I got real thorough. Let me tell you what, real thorough. I'm talking about like 4 years old, like imaginary resentments thorough, and I don't want anything to do with my old life at all. It was hard to be in it. And I was so hopeless, that this really offered me something different. And I grasped onto that like a lifeline, like a drowning man, really. And so I started making friends, and my 4th step really showed me how I feel about women. I view them as competition and not that they're not to be trusted, right? So that was something I had to get over because I was only allowed to talk to women, unfortunately, right? Unfortunately, that was the first thing I had to do, is I had to be BFF with women, and since I had a car and a license and insurance, right, what happened was I started picking up my pigeon sisters, women that my sponsor sponsors as well, and I would pick them up, and they had 4, 5, 6 years, and for whatever reason, they didn't have a car, or a license, whichever, and so I would pick them up, and we would go to the noon, and then we would hang out all day, and then we would go to the night meeting, and I was I made about 180 meetings in 90 days. And then I was going to conferences. I was going and doing sober things. They're like, oh, we're going to go bowling. I was like, I don't like bowling. I was like, I didn't even like bowling when I was drinking, But I went because I was told to, And my sponsor really saved my life, and that she told me what I should do when I needed that, And when I had about a year sober, she told me that I wasn't allowed to. I had to start making decisions for myself, right? Which is scary, I don't trust myself. To this day, I still don't trust myself in certain situations, which is why I use the network of women that I've developed here. I don't trust myself being on campus on the weekend, I don't trust that, so I don't go, It's knowing that sometimes there's a healthy level of insecurity in that for me. If I don't feel strongly, if I feel like I shouldn't go, I shouldn't go. If there is a reason that I have to, I try to take someone sober with me. I've been to weddings sober, and I always try and take someone sober with me, just to make sure that I have the buddy system, right? If I'm like, okay, I don't feel good, let's go, right? There's someone to go with. Someone to be like, okay, it's extra accountability, really, is what I'm trying to get at. It's extra accountability, and that's why, for me, the more people I'm accountable to, the easier it is for me to tell on myself. The easier it is for me to stay sober one day at a time. If I feel like there are other people around me that understand that it's not just, I'm not weird in that I don't drink. It's that there is a reason I don't drink. It's not safe for me to drink. And I know for me to drink is to die, because I came really, really close before. I had a lot of health issues as a result of my drinking and the way I was living before I got sober. I was in the hospital at 6 months sober from an intestinal infection because my body had shut down because I wasn't eating, I wasn't hydrated, and first and only time I ever had morphine, and let me tell you what, I didn't want any part of it, especially because they gave it to me in front of my sponsor, and so I panicked, my dad was there telling my sponsor she needed to take a video of it, and then I was freaking out because I thought I had to change my sobriety date, and it was really uncomfortable because she was laughing at me, right, so I got really insecure and really anxious. Story of my life. I'm ruled by fear in many shapes and forms, still today. I'm not comfortable speaking in front of people because I feel like if I tell you my story, then that means it's more for you to judge me on, right? Even though it's not about judgment, it's not about any of that. For me, it's a big fear that I have. It's easy to play the dits. It's easy to play, some role that I assign to myself because then I know what I think you're going to judge me on versus, the real me that I don't hide, right? And being sober in Alcoholics Anonymous is truly a gift and a privilege, Like, I'm not guaranteed a seat. Every day is a reprieve. It's a daily reprieve. I have to do something different every day. I have to do, different in my old life, but I have to do the same things in Alcoholics Anonymous that I did in the first day. I read the big book every morning, and depending on how my inventory was the night before, I may read several sections of the big book every morning, and I read the daily reflections and other aspects of AA-approved literature, and sometimes I have some spiritual literature that I read. Creating a connection with my higher power is not something that came easy to me. It was easy for me to believe, but not easy to have faith. Moving down here was really hard for me. It was really hard for me, uprooting from where I was safe. I felt like I was safe back home because everywhere I turned, I lived in a sober house, so I lived with sober people. There was I had classes with sober people. I saw sober people every day of the week. I had 4 different service positions. I was actively involved, and I felt like I had a reputation there, and coming down here and really having to start over in planting my feet was something that I was afraid of. I had panic attacks leading up to my move down here because I was afraid that AA was going to be different, and that I wasn't going to be able to stay sober, and I hit my bottom down here. So it was really, really difficult for me to face a lot of the damage that I did on a daily basis. I passed that house that I bought every day, and I guess it was a blessing. It was a blessing for me to move back down here because it really doubled my faith. It really cemented that foundation for me, and that God's not going to drop me on my butt. He didn't bring me this far to do that. And every day I find that I test it. That I do something and I'm just like, I'm not going to be taken care of. And that's just my innate fear because I feel like I can be self-sufficient to the extreme, like I can do it by myself, for myself. I don't need you. I don't need anybody else. And then little by little, I've built up every brick in that wall until it's separating me from you, And when I do that, I'm right next to my old friend, the drink, right? And I have a hard time sometimes getting beneath the surface level, right? It's easy to talk about the little things, like the petty resentments, but it's hard to talk about what really makes me tick, what really fuels my fears and my insecurities, getting down to the causes and the conditions for me. It's something that I still struggle with, and I'm definitely not perfect, and I'm not saying that anybody should be, regardless of how much time. It's just something that I know that I struggle with, and I hope someone relates to that. And I heard at a conference, I think a year and a half ago, I heard someone talk about how alcoholics are like a frog trying to boil a frog, right? You try and put the frog in the boiling water and the frog's going to jump out, right? But what happens with us is we get used to things. So you just put, room temperature water on the stove and put the frog in the pot. Frog's not going to jump out. But you turn up the heat little by little, right? And before you know it, the water's boiling, the frog's content, and the frog is dead, right? And that's how my alcoholism is for me. It was a gradual but progressive illness. In a year and a half, I went from drinking like, maybe a little out of hand to living like an animal, ruled by instincts. And I don't say that lightly. It's hard to talk about because I remember it so clearly. And it was definitely something that made it that much easier for me to have the gift of desperation. I firmly believe it took what it took, and the first time I was introduced, I wasn't ready to be done. And this time I was, and hopefully I don't ever have to take a drink again, and I know what I need to do to stay here, and if I ever get confused, my sponsor surely writes me immediately. and other women that I talk to on a regular basis too. My sponsor's not the only person that knows my inventory on a regular basis. I have a network of about 10 women and a few men that I talk to, if not daily, then every other day. And sometimes I talk to them about stuff before I talk to my sponsor about it, just kind of to test the waters with that one. But I always end up telling my sponsor, and I know sometimes when I'm going to get scolded, and then she doesn't scold me. She just says, well, it's your experience, and it's your sobriety, right? And I know that today it's a miracle that I'm sober. It's a miracle that any of us are sober. This many alcoholics not drunk in one place, it's kind of a big deal, and I'm reminded of that every time I walk into a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm really grateful to be sober today, and I'm grateful to be here. So, thanks.